Good evening to everyone online, and good evening to everyone who's here. Yeah, well, I'm glad you forgot, and that's why you're here. Okay, all right. Take some source sheets. I will share also with this. Okay. I will share as well a link in the chat. Okay. All right. Well, good evening. While I was walking over here, I was listening to Rabbi Wolkenfeld's Parsha Shiur, and he began by saying that it's hard to learn Torah when everything is so awful. And but he said something like learning Torah is something that's always appropriate for every circumstance, and so which I think is true. So I just with that caveat that things are really terrible, but this is what we do. We learn Torah. So and this is I think an important topic that has it's explains a lot about how we live. So I think it's worth some time. So we're going to focus mostly on a tshuva again by Moshe Feinstein. That's our second source. But to understand, you want to go back to Gemara in the Masechet Shabbat, which is as follows. Like I said, I'll read mostly in English for this source at least. The sage is taught in a Tosefta. One may open a canal that passes adjacent to a garden on Shabbat Eve, on Friday at nightfall, Erev Shabbatim Chashecha, before nightfall, so the water will flow into a garden, and the garden continuously fills with water all day long on Shabbat. Okay, you understand? You have like an irrigation, a whole series of fields with the channels, with irrigation. You open it up, and the field is watered on Shabbat, but not by you, by gravity. Okay. Similarly, when we place incense, perfumed herbs placed on coals to produce a fragrance on coals beneath the clothes on Shabbat Eve, and the clothes may continuously be perfumed all day long. Okay, so you're scenting your clothing, you set it up before Shabbat, and it just goes automatically. Similarly, when we place an eye salve on the eye and a bandage smeared with cream on a wound on Shabbat Eve at nightfall, and the wound may continuously heal all day long on Shabbat. Again, refuah is a forbidden activity on Shabbat, except for exceptions. You can't do medical interventions on Shabbat, but you can do this before Shabbat, and the healing process is continuously going over the course of Shabbat. However, one may not place wheat kernels into the watermill unless he does so in a way so that they will be ground while it is still day on Friday and not on Shabbat. So somehow certain processes you're allowed to set in motion on Friday before Shabbat starts, and that even though it's going to continuously do this forbidden activity automatically into Shabbat, but you're not, so a whole bunch you're allowed to, but you're not allowed to do this watermill. You can't have your watermill grinding your grains over the course of Shabbat. So that's the Braita. So the Gemara then asks, what's the reason that the Braita prohibited a mill and permitted other prohibited labors? What's the difference? Why is there one rule for the irrigation and one rule for the watermill? So Rabbah said, because it makes noise and the public will hear the mill grinding on Shabbat. And in the Hebrew it says, Amarava, mipnei shem mishma'at kol. It makes noise. This is sort of the sound equivalent of married ayin. It sounds like you're doing something prohibited, right? Married ayin is Morris ayin is okay. It looks like you're doing something prohibited. Hashmat kol is that it sounds like you're doing something prohibited. The sound of the grinding of the grain on Shabbat is not what we want. Rabbi Yosef responds to him. Maybe there's another reason. Maybe the reason why we don't have our mill grinding on Shabbat is because of shvitat kelim, which is the rest of our tools. Not just we should rest on Shabbat. Shvitat kelim is a position that our tools should rest as well. Right, which means even back in English, even the utensils of a Jewish person may not be used for prohibited labor on Shabbat, as was taught in this midrash in the Mechilta. That which is stated. And in all that I said to you, take heed, Exodus 12. So there's a midrash that says that includes resting that utensil, shvitat kelim, that our objects also have to have a day off, not just us. Rather, Yosef said the reason for the prohibition of the mill on Shabbat is due to the resting of utensils. Okay, very nice. Now that Rav Shaya said that Rav Ashi said who is the Tan who states the obligation of resting utensils on Shabbat is by Torah. That's Beit Shammai, not Beit Hillel. Consequently, according to Beit Shammai, whether the utensil performs an action or whether it does not perform an action, it is prohibited. According to Beit Hillel, even though it performs an action, it is nonetheless permitted. So the Gemara resolves that actually is a position of Shvitat Kelim that we not just we have to rest on Shabbat, but our tools also have to rest on Shabbat. That position, though, seems to be traced back to Beit Shammai, who is not loses out on our halachic debates. And so the dominant position of Beit Hillel is that Shvitat Kelim is permissible. So our tools are allowed to do things on Shabbat. And the only reason why you can't have your millstone grinding is because of Hashmat Kol. It just sounds, you don't want to the grinding of the mill, it's like very loud, and you wouldn't want that to happen on Shabbat. Wouldn't it make more sense of the issue that the sound is disturbing the ambience of Shabbos rather than Maris Ayin? So it's not Maris Ayin, it's Hashmat Kol, which is the sound equivalent. And you want to say that maybe that is that overlap with not a Shabbostic environment, so maybe it does. And maybe there's some overlap with those concepts.
I think I remember looking this up, but I think the Shulchan Aruch kind of points it in that direction. Like the sound itself is disruptive.
Yeah, the sound, right? Well, it's this. It sounds like you're doing. Yeah, we don't want to have like ruckus on Shabbat, but so it's okay. So that's, and I would just say, based on this conclusion of the Gemara, we have this long tradition of having of doing things that don't make noise on Shabbat, as long as you set it up in advance, so that you press your things, you leave your wool in the thing to dye. Your clothing fabric is getting dyed, on over Shabbat, etc. And even in pre-modern times, they had various mechanisms for cooking certain things using very long wicks that you could, that to even, I think in the 16th century, somebody had this device 17th century to make coffee using a very, very long wick that would, Shabbos morning, it would this little fire would go off, it would boil his coffee or something. So that was, there's like a well-established practice. And then, electric timers are, become a 20th century phenomenon. Moshe Feinstein has asked about it in source 2. This is 20th Kislev, 1976. Oh, so almost 20th Kislev. So we're about, a month away from the anniversary of this Jew being raised. Okay?
Rabbi, a question.
Yeah.
Is there a distinction between the noise being made somewhere else? For example, a power plant that burns fuel.
Very good. If it makes noise where no one can hear it,
right.
Are we concerned about that? That's a good question. That's a great question. You what?
Tree fall.
Oh, tree fall. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Right. If good. If a tree falls in a forest, right? If a mill turns an empty, that's a good. With married ayin, we don't necessarily care. Generally, married ayin, even if it's in private, you're not allowed to do something that's prohibited because of married ayin. You are allowed to do once the context changes. So that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Whether that would be an issue with power plants. The issue, it's not. The issue with power plants is that somebody has to operate them, and so can't. And those people are generally not Jewish. Certainly, the majority of them are not Jewish. And the people who are doing it for are a majority not Jewish. So that's sort of less of a, people aren't asking that question. In Israel, where people might be using the power plant and operating the power are Jewish. So there are two approaches. One approach is to recognize that the power plants have to be operating so that hospitals can have electricity. And once it's operating, you can operate for everyone. It's not necessarily extra malacha to have a power plant operating at 100% versus 5% for all the hospitals that need it. It's not maybe it is, but it's not necessarily more malacha. It's either on or off, and once it's on, so it has to be on because hospitals need electricity, and so you might as well use it otherwise. There are other approaches. There are people who are strict though, and certainly in Jerusalem there are communities that would they used to connect to the Jordanian power grid, so that when East Jerusalem was Jordanian, they would connect to the Jordanian power grid, so they wouldn't use Jewish electricity on Shabbos. So that was a position that I don't know what they've done more recently. I don't know if that there are people who have been strict about that.
Surely the power plant does not produce more electricity because you're using power.
Right. Sure. Well, if every Shomer Shabbos Jew didn't use electricity on Shabbat, then that might be noticeable. They might burn a little less. But even so, you don't want to benefit, be complicit in their Chil Shabbat. Okay. So here's the question. Regarding an electronic device, is it possible to use a timer that can be set in place before Shabbat in a fashion that the device will begin to cook on the next day, Shabbat itself, 1 hour before the meal? And your brother Aaron Baruch asked me about this. Okay, so there's the question. Okay, so using a timer just to operate an oven or a platta or a coffee maker or whatever, so any such device. Okay, that's the question. So based on what we've seen so far, it really should be fine unless the device makes a lot of noise. So maybe you have a timer to operate your washing machine, that might be a problem, but a timer to operate, turn on your toaster or your oven or your plata or your coffee maker, that should be fine because shvitat kelim is not a prohibition, right? According to Beit Hillel, whom we accept, okay? But he says as follows, okay? I'll read and start off in Hebrew because I think the phrasing is really significant. Hine, b'davar sha'yidei chashmal, inyan ha'electri. Okay, efshar yidei moreh sha'ot, hanaseh lekach, shi'amidenu be'erev Shabbat, courage. Be'ofen she'atchil levashel lemachar b'yom ha'Shabbat, keshar lefnei zman achil. It's going to start cooking about an hour before lunchtime. Asher achicha nechdi hayakar Aaron Baruch shlita shoel, your brother, my grandchild, okay, look, okay, Aaron Baruch Shlita, okay, asked this question. Hine, according to my humble opinion, Pashut she'asor lahatirze. This phrase, you can write a book on this phrase, this sentence. It's forbidden to permit this. Okay? He doesn't say it's forbidden. He says it's forbidden to permit it. Okay, this is a teacher of mine checked. I think there are maybe 5 or 10 occasions in English where he uses this phrase. Each one is worth exploring. It's a very It's not the thing. He doesn't say the thing itself is forbidden. He says we can't allow it. Right? Okay.
This phrase is peculiar. Then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Factories. Now that we have this era of automation, it's 1976, okay? It's modern times now. We could have timers and everything could operate on Shabbat. We could have factories operating, making everything. Everything could be set up on a timer and there would be no greater zilzul Shabbat, like a denigration, cheapening of Shabbat than having our entire modern economy being operated according to, using timers. Yeah.
What exactly it's forbidden to permit mean? Like, are you allowed to do things that are not forbidden, are neither forbidden nor permitted?
I think he's saying.
I mean, what is it?
I think I think it's a term that he invents, as far as I know. So we can sort of see what he means by it. I think he's saying, it doesn't reach the standard of evidence to say it's forbidden because based on precedent, I can't say that. But I think that to allow it would be disastrous. So I'm going to say it's forbidden to permit it. That's my read. You could, right? You understand the difference? It's a subtle difference. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. Okay. You want your it's a.
I'm just not sure if can I do things? So I guess it comes down to whether I can do things that haven't been expressly permitted because they also haven't been forbidden.
Okay, sorry, so one more time.
Can I do things?
What happens to your non-enumerated rights?
They haven't been expressed. Do we need things to be expressly permitted?
No, I mean, very good. The default, I think the default is things are permissible unless you can find a way to. I think the burden of proof is on the side of rendering things forbidden.
So then you could. In which case you could.
Oh, so why does it need to be permitted? Isn't the default permissible?
He's not forbidding it, so that you could do it.
Well, and maybe saying if you did it, you're not in the eyes of Shemayim, you don't get a red X next to your name if you do it. But as a matter of policy, this can't happen because of what it will lead to. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. This is also great. Okay, Baror. She'im haya ze bizman atznaim va'amoraim hayu osrin ze k'moshe asru amir la'aku mitam ze. V'gam ulai hu memela b'chlal isur ze da'asru amir la'akum da'asru kol malacha da'naset b'shvil Yisrael mitzad amirat Yisrael v'kol sheken mitzad ma'aseh Yisrael. So if it were in the time of the rabbis, if it was a time of the Talmud, they would have prohibited this as a rabbinic prohibition. When we had the power, when rabbis had the power to legislate new prohibitions to Rabbanan, obviously they would have prohibited this. If we still had that power, this would have been a Rabbanan. And then he said maybe even this actually, just like they prohibited us to ask a Gentile to do work for us on Shabbat, which is also a rabbinic prohibition to ask a Gentile to do work for a Jew, and maybe this is kind of like the same maybe this falls under the prohibition of Amir La'akum, right? What's Amir La'akum? It's maybe the problem is that the Jew is saying words that lead to malacha being done on Shabbat. And so this should be no less than that, because I'm adjusting the timer and malacha is done on Shabbat. So maybe even I don't have to say that had this existed in the time of the rabbis, they would have prohibited this to Rabbanan, or had we had retained that legislative power, we would prohibit this the dins Rabbanan, because you can say, well, no, maybe this falls under that rubric as well.
Can you arrange with a non-Jew before Shabbat? Or is it the same prohibition as
Generally not. I mean, generally you can't.
Distinction.
I don't believe there's a distinction. The only distinction is like certain leniencies about for the sake of a mitzvah,
Right.
for the sake of it's very cold or very hot or needs of the majority, of the multitudes, or yeah. Below dami l'mashem mutar lahamid kedera al gabi ha'esh afilu rega achat kodem haShabbat sheyitbashel b'Shabbat v'lo asru rabbanan kishalek chash chitui b'Shabbat taf yud chan avet tehu mishum dekol malacha ha'oseh adam b'melechet bishul hu hamadat kedera al gabi ha'esh to be'etzem habishul eino oseh hadam. Okay, this is not similar to what if I put a pot on top of the fire right before Shabbat starts, and then on Shabbat is when it actually boils and cooks. So that's permissible, unless under a circumstance where there's no concern that you're going to stoke the fire. So if it's if you have a blech, or it's the cover of the knobs, whatever it is, there's no concern of the rabbinic concerns of chitzui, of stoking the fire. So you can put something on right before Shabbat starts, a second before Shabbat starts, and all the cooking takes place on Shabbat, because we understand the action of cooking that a person does is always, like, a person never cooks. A person only puts food in proximity to heat. That is from the perspective of a human being, cooking is placing food in proximity to heat. The actual cooking is being done by the fire and the pot and the food, without human involvement, always, 7 days a week. And so if you do the human action of placing food in proximity to fire before Shabbat starts, so that's fine. So there's rabbinic prohibitions and restrictions about how you do that, because we're worried that your guests are coming and you'll be nervous, you're going to soak the fire, so it cooks. So fine. But just on the actual malacha part, totally different. But here the This is very interesting, and this is probably maybe the weakest part of his argument. I think he's saying it's different to putting the pot on top of the fire. You've done everything that a person can do in the realm of cooking, and all that remains is for the fire to do its thing and the food to do its thing. When you set a timer, on your electric stove, and you plug it into a timer on Friday, it's cold, it's off. Nothing related to cooking has yet happened. And so you haven't done all the things. You haven't placed food in proximity to heat on Friday. Food only becomes placed in proximity to heat when the timer clicks on Shabbos morning.
That's true of the canals as well.
It's true of the canals as well.
If you had a pipe, let's say you put a pipe right at the start of the canal.
Oh, good.
So there was really no watering of the ground. Then you have a timer, right? Like the water enters the pipe.
A pipe is essentially a timer.
Pipe is a timer. So like the Gemara makes pretty clear this stuff.
Good response. You understand that anyone agree with his distinction? You like it, or
Well, maybe clarify. I mean, I thought it was like you're opening a canal before Shabbat started,
Yeah.
but it will continue. But when the action has already begun.
No. I'm saying, let's say, right, you can't put the water on the ground. Like, putting water on the ground is malacha. Maybe not if it's just sand. I don't know. But like, let's just assume it is. Right, if you're not watering something.
No, it's
Let's say
yeah.
it is, right. So you've got your headwaters here, and you got a field here, right? You've got a pipe from here to here.
Mhm.
The minute you create that connection between your stream and your pipe, you've established a timer.
You could do that
Because-
Friday, yeah.
You could do that Erev Shabbos, right? Because you're not watering anything. No water is going to anything other than a pipe, which isn't being watered. It's just a pipe. And so you are starting your process before Shabbos. You're doing no malacha in the interim, just waiting for your electricity to trickle from
He
your.
would say to you, the malacha of irrigating a field is placing water, like there's a physics. It's not food in proximity to heat. It's water in proximity to dirt and gravity in a situation where gravity will bring the two together. And you've done all of that on Friday, as opposed to plugging in your thing to the timer. You haven't done anything because there isn't you're missing some of the ingredients, like the food's not in proximity to heat. So to me, it seems like plugging into the timer is very similar to placing it on the fire. That's why I experience it, right? That's why I experience it. But he's saying it is really different. It's missing, the food is not close to heat until it goes
It's
on.
not just close, it's the only purpose for putting that pipe is to connect the water to the soil.
Yeah.
Whereas a timer, you're setting up an electronic circuit that could have other purposes too. So there's a degree of separation that doesn't exist in the case of the pipe.
But it doesn't have that other purpose in the moment, right?
Right, in the moment, nothing's
Right.
happened, I agree.
No, I mean yes, pipe could have many purposes, but in the moment that you put it between your stream and your field, it has no other purpose than to irrigate.
Right.
And yes, a timer could be used for many things, but like at 5:46 on a Friday afternoon, when you put it between your crock pot and your.
There's only one thing.
There's only one thing.
Yeah. All right. So let's look at the next paragraph. Next paragraph, he's going to address these concerns. Okay. See the Namuke Yosef Baba Kama. I'm in English now. Okay, whatever. Okay. And who responds to the question asked regarding the position that an individual is responsible for the action of a fire he set because a show mishum chetzav. Okay, so this is it's a good. We're starting Baba Kama this week today, right? So why are you responsible for? You light a fire, the fire goes off and burns down someone's whatever. You're responsible, even though you light the fire here. The fire burns, something tomorrow far away, you're still responsible. So one of the positions the Gemara addresses, it's because it's like an arrow you shoot. You shoot an arrow and you're responsible for wherever that arrow ends up, whatever damage it ends up causing, even though you're here and it ends up causing damage far away someplace else without your intention necessarily, but you're still responsible. It's directly the result of your actions. You light a fire here, it goes off someplace else and burns something down, I'm still responsible. Okay, because the fire is like my arrow. If that's so, if a fire is like your arrow and I'm responsible for what I light the fire, it does something tomorrow, someplace else, I'm still responsible, then why can't I light a Shabbos candle on Friday before Shabbat? Good question, right? And so, and similarly, lighting the wick of a torch before Shabbat that will burn on Shabbat, okay, a long torch, it's a little bit long wick, it's going to light a fire later on. According to this position, it's as if the lighter himself lit the fire on Shabbat, right? I'm responsible, it's like my arrow. And his answer, the Mukha Yosef, this position that it's like an arrow he has shot means that at the time when the arrow leaves his hand, it is as though he did all of the resulting actions. And in our case, that time is before Shabbat. So the arrow leaves my bow and does some damage, like it's all traced back, because from the perspective of Newtonian physics, right? The moment I let go, release my finger, it was all predictable and the direct outcome of my action, even if it takes a few minutes. Likewise, if you had a little better meteorology, but if I light my fire, wherever it's going to, end up spreading, that's actually predictable. It's just, and therefore it's all the direct outcome. Like everything was set in place when I lit that fire, where it would end up going. Right? We're not assuming a, what do you call it? Like a quantum physics? Like the weather is right. I think people now say the weather is like entirely unpredictable, right? And doesn't follow Newtonian physics, maybe, but that's okay. So let's leave that aside. I once tried to give a shiur on quantum physics and uncertainty in Talmudic thought, which was I'd like to try again. It was
Is there a principle here of this to be a causal, totally predictable, 100% guaranteed result for there to be that?
It seems to be. But that's what the fire, because it is like your arrow, seems to be saying, that you're responsible for my fire because my fire is like my arrow. The arrow just does what exactly. And yes. And this is similar to that which is found in Shabbat 18a, which we saw. We root water to a garden before Shabbat, and it fills the garden the entire day. We place frankincense under clothing and pitch under silver vessels before Shabbat, for the work begins being done immediately before Shabbat. And so too, it is essentially permitted to place wheat into a water mill for Shabbat, were it not Were it not for the decree prohibiting this because of the sound, as Rabbi explained. And even the grains that are ground on Shabbat were set in place to be ground before Shabbat when they were placed in the water mill. It's like all grist for the meal. I throw it in, okay, and I say good Shabbos, and I walk out the door, like that. They're all going to be ground. Everything was set in place before Shabbat start. However, this is very different from a case of an electronic timer. Why? Because the device doing the action begins to do that action only at a certain time. The device is not connected to electricity until the timer activates. And so setting the timer cannot be considered the start of the action.
So it doesn't seem to be like a direct causal relationship. Instead, it's an intervening cause that
Right,
is the problem.
so degree separated.
Yeah, like the device is not connected to electricity when Shabbat starts. And it's not going to be until Shabbos morning when the timer clicks on. Setting the timer is a sort of predictive action, but cannot be considered as though the action was done at the time the timer was set before the onset of Shabbat. Maybe that's right. Let's see how it says in Hebrew. שזה נעשה מתחילה קודם שנתחבר אלקטרי לא שייך לקשר שעושה בגלל חברת אלקטרי באופן שהתברר בשעה עוונית בשעה היירית סוף חמה לבוא דאין לכך שיבו למעשיו עתה בערב שבת. כי זה איצה בסנהדרין דף עין זין. כל הגבנו לא נחשב מעשיו לחייבו דוודא לא שייך לדמות. לכפתו והביאו במקום שסוף חמה לבוא שמקרב הדבר אצל הערב. So so we do have predictive, we do have a case, you can be liable for murder, right? If you put somebody in a place where he's gonna, be exposed to the sun, he's gonna, you're tying him up. I think that does count as a murder because you're tying him up and eventually the sun will rise and will just die of exposure to the sun, right? So even though at the time when you tie him up, you're not killing him. But that's considered sof chama levo. It's definitely going to happen. That's different. He says that's different. To make the one who does them guilty, and these are different cases. Where one ties a person, leaves him, the sun will eventually shine, which is like placing something in the path of a fire, which is considered to be his arrows. That is like the case of killing a person with a flow of water, where the first force alone is directly counted to the killer, and therefore setting a timer is not the same as considering a process in place as though the action is completed, right? So as in Sanhedrin, there's like different degrees of responsibility for indirect causation, and this is the latter degree. So you do on Friday is not considered directly you haven't done everything necessary such that it would be considered done before Shabbat, like the other cases. I don't know. These seem to be some very subtle different. I don't know.
In this analysis, the inevitability of the murder is a pro for the purposes of the permissibility of the timer.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. Let's continue. And once we no longer consider the action to be completed already before Shabbat, and even though it cannot be a biblical violation of Shabbat, even to the Mukha Yosef, even if we say that one who lights a fire that then burns his neighbor's field is responsible for his earlier actions of lighting a fire, we do not say the latter burning could make the fire starter liable for Shabbat violations. If we only obligate a person for his forces like his body for tort law, but not for Shabbat law. And this is explicitly Gemara in the case of a dog that ignites a fire, is not considered to be the direct responsibility of its owner, who must only pay half damages. If the person himself lit the fire, there is no possibility of a person paying only half damages, or he must pay full damages. One who murders in this manner is liable for that too, can be accomplished through forces, but we do not find a case of Shabbat liability for a force that is a result of an action a person does directly before Shabbat. And the Mukha Yosef must be questioned for this, not sufficient to make one obligated biblically on Shabbat. That's interesting, right? So it seems that in cases where we could obligate somebody, you could be obligated for damages and maybe even for killing somebody, but you would never be obligated for Shabbat violation for this indirect causation, which is good to know. That's actually very useful because a lot of things in our world are grown like all these electronic sensors that turn lights on and automatic toilets and things like these are all grama. These are all indirect causation. So the fact that it's good to know that it's if an automatic toilet, ruins your neighbor's carpet, then you could be liable, but you're not liable for Shabbos. Okay, it's not your right. Okay. And then he goes on, even we're one to say that we cannot forbid what the sages did not forbid, and that one cannot derive from their decrees prohibitions against things that are rationally more stringent, since regardless they themselves do not prohibit, even though this was because the case did not exist in their time, and thus, actual prohibition, nonetheless, one should not permit it, since it is something that it would be appropriate to forbid. Okay, so the sages didn't prohibit this, and we can't make new Durabanans. We don't have the power. Oh, I see your hand. We don't have the power to make new prohibitions, but even if it's logical, right? They prohibited this, and this is even more severe. They prohibited Amir Lenochri, asking a Gentile. This is much more problematic than just asking a Gentile to do something. So it should be prohibited, but we can't do that. But let's not do it anyway, right? Like, why we can't do it? Okay? We can't say it's forbidden. I can't say it's a Drabanan, but I also can't permit it. Yeah, Susan?
I guess I'm just curious, like practically, like with the timer, going back to the timer, and the cooking.
Yeah.
So, like, if you start the cooking going like before Shabbos, and then you have the timer shut off, like after the food has fully cooked, and then kind of like go on and off and on and off, like
Yeah.
is that
Let's see. We'll get there. Hold on. We'll give some practical guidance at the end. Okay, let's hold on. All right. Goodness. Okay. But there's another great reason to prohibit it, and that is because of the cheapening of the dignity of Shabbat. And even cheapening the dignity of Yom Tov is a basis to prohibit many things. And since it is clear that Shabbat is also at risk of having its dignity, so in other words, Zilzul Yom Tov is a concept that's in Halakah, that's in the Gemara. We do all sorts of things. So out of concern for Zilzul Yom Tov, of not taking Yom Tov really seriously. That's like a halachic principle. So he says, well, Zilzul Shabbos is even worse, even though it's not a term that the Gemara talks about. Even though are singled out, regarding this was any aspect of cheapening. So we can't do anything that makes Shabbos less, kind of dignified. It is. Also, obviously, the one who does something that cheapens the dignity of Shabbat is directly violating the obligation to honor Shabbat, which is a Torah obligation explained by the prophets. Rambam writes at the beginning of chapter 30 of Hilchot Shabbat that there are 4 things that regarding Shabbat. 2 are from the Torah, 2 from the sages, and are explained by the prophets. He did not write that these were enacted by the prophets, and therefore it seems that he intends to say that the matter is from the Torah. And the phrase "from the sages" is also a way that Rambam refers to Torah laws that are not explicit in the Torah, but that of the force of Torah law. And the Maggid Mishnah, Kesef Mishnah explained this is the first chapter of Ishur regarding Rambam's statement that Kiddushin with money is from the sages. And see there, okay, so in other words, it seems that Rambam talks about things from the sages that really have the power of Torah law, like betrothal with money, okay? And so too, when he says that the obligation to honor Shabbat and respect Shabbat, owning Shabbat and kavod Shabbat, which are not said in the Torah, but these are it's in the prophets. It's sort of a lesser degree, but it has the force of Torah law. That's what Rambam says. And the obligation to honor Shabbat is explained by the prophets, and Rambam there explains all the details of actions we do to honor Shabbat. Like we clean ourselves and we clean our clothing and we all this, we eat good food, and should be automatically assumed from this that any action whose performance would be lessening the honor of Shabbat is violating the obligation to honor Shabbat, and is even violating the honor in a particularly bad way because he's doing so actively. Therefore, even if we say that setting a timer is not included in the decrees of the sages, but even without that, one who sets a timer is violating the obligation to honor Shabbat, and this is a cheapening of Shabbat that is obvious to all. And so it is my opinion to forbid setting up a timer on Friday that will cause an electric device to operate on Shabbat. That's his position against timers. But nonetheless, he concludes, the already regnant practice of turning off lights on Shabbat via timers and of setting them to go on again at the end of the day should not be prohibited as extinguishing the large candelabras known as lamps, which were actual fire, was permitted in practice to everyone through the medium of a Gentile. And there were also places that would have the non-Jews relight them for the final prayer on Yom Kippur. And the consequence of this was that they say in some places they had a Gentile light Friday for Kabbalat Shabbat, although many protested against this, see the note of Yehuda. But he also gives a rationale for those who prohibit, and the Ramah notes without objection the popular lenient practice to ask a Gentile to light for meals, especially a meal for a wedding or bris, and it is implied that for the sake of a great need, it is permitted. And therefore, even though it is appropriate to forbid in our area of Europe, it was prohibited. Nonetheless, since there are a multitude who permitted, and such was done in many places, it is not right to prohibit that which many have already done, to set up an electric timer on Friday that will extinguish and relight lights on Shabbat. And certainly there's no cheapening of Shabbat through this, and there's no other reason to prohibit this in the places where it is done. And on the contrary, it is a mitzvah to honor the meals of Shabbat with light. And so only the first reason is relevant, and here we can be lenient. However, to add to this and permit cooking or other labors through a timer is prohibited. Your loving grandfather, Moshe Feinstein. Okay? What do we think about that? Reactions, responses? And so he gives two different, he has the light again, just to be clear, he says using a timer for a light is okay for two reasons. One is that we have an existing custom of, since right, he compared the timer to labor done through a Gentile, and since we have a very old practice of having Gentiles light and extinguish and relight lights for us, for the sake of a mitzvah or the sake of the congregation, etc. So we can also use a timer for lights. And second, he says there's no issue of Zilzal Shabbat, of cheapening Shabbat, because it enhances our Shabbat experience to have lights on, in the shul and in our homes, etc. But not for anything else, not for cooking, not for anything else.
So the timers are Shabbos goy. Basically.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's only for those things where you could ask a Shabbos goy for, or things that are similar enough to it. Yeah. That's a good. Yeah.
What about the sound though? There's not an issue with like the sound of the timer going off.
No, it's not a timer that makes this, like a clock, like a little, like a
Oh,
like a timer that not a you need like a timer.
oh, not like an alarm.
Yeah, you plug
Oh.
your thing into it. Never in a smart homes now. It's not like it's not.
But they need shubbas around this time. They did permit in Europe, as he said, for like non-Jews to do those malachot. That might shed some light on what the thinking then was, because he's relying on that as precedent. But what was the
Why do we had it going back to the origins of Gentiles turning lights on and stuff like that? Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, by Jacob Katz. Yeah, Jacob Katz wrote a book called the Shabbos Goy, Goy Shel Shabbat, like the history of this idea going from the Talmudic times to modern times. I think the principles are it's a drabanan to ask a Gentile, and for the sake of lighting fires also for heat, like everyone, you're allowed to ask a Gentile for someone who's sick, and the Gemara says, or the Rishonim say, everyone is considered sick when it comes to the cold. When confronted with the cold, everyone is considered sick. So they can light your fires in your stove and your furnace to warm up the house, and so
It seems sort of circular, right? He's saying it doesn't cheapen Shabbat because people have done this in the past, but and so it doesn't feel like
good. It doesn't cheapen Shabbat because everyone does it, and it doesn't cheapen Shabbat because it makes Shabbat nicer to have light on, as opposed to other things which don't. So I think you're right, and I think actually. Yeah, so I think you're right. And I was just like, personally, I think that's sort of where I've taken. I mean, I think he's right that to see the danger in automation and timers and the power they have to eliminate Shabbat. Like if you have your television go on with a timer, then Shabbos is over. Right. But that's really, there's no difference between a timer turning on the lamp in your dining room and turning on the radio and the television. Okay, right, and then the dishwasher and the vacuum, your vacuum cleaner, right? Whatever, your robotic vacuum cleaner could go and clean up after dinner, right? Okay, so there's really no difference, and what we're left with is, I think, a kind of like ritual instinct that we remarkably in for the last generation or two, we've had a sense that Shabbos actually works. We kind of like it, and we sort of like the way it feels. And we want to protect that. And so we're sort of left with kind of instinct of like, okay, we're going to use a timer for a light in my dining room, and maybe we'll use a timer for a coffee maker. Maybe if my dishwasher is really quiet and I can use a timer to wash my dishes, but not for radio, not for television, not for reading my emails, because we just have a sense that would be really harmful to what we're trying to do on Shabbat.
It seems like we're moving into a kind of like common sense, almost like as opposed to any like real robust halakha. Yeah,
it seems a little bit like common sense, a little bit like you sort of know when you see it, a little bit like just sort of and yet it kind of works. Somebody I was reading over an old there's a period of time where people wrote like people wrote informal essays on blogs. You could find them, and now it's the last 10 years all been like Facebook discussion. So a professor wrote a very, I thought, interesting Facebook comment, which sparked a interesting conversation about 7 or 8 years ago, and it was in my Facebook memories a few days ago. I was like, oh yeah, this is a really interesting conversation, But so he contrasted the way the lack, sort of the contentious way in which all of the sort of feminism and orthodoxy questions have sort of been really, really divisive and led to a lack of sort of a real kind of defensiveness / attack on the whole concept of rabbinic authority and like and how it's deploying itself and all these ways about, and in contrast to Shabbat, where there seems to be like a great deal of like kind of, not that there aren't disputes, but there's like just a great general consensus, respect for the guidance of like the rabbinic, establishment, and he suggests because everyone kind of knows what Shabbos is supposed to be like, and they kind of like it, and we're sort of invested in that, whereas nobody really knows what it means to be a Jewish woman or a Jewish man, and 5784, and so there's like when
they do, they don't like it.
They do, they don't like it. Okay, so when rabbis say things, you like prove it, like where's that, why, like, where, right, like this kind of like it's a sort, it's forbidden to permit, and like even though I can't quite say it's forbidden, we definitely can't allow it, you shouldn't do it, it wasn't done, but this is sort of right when those kinds of arguments, kind of make their way into like issues about like gender roles. Everyone's like, whoa, like come on, that's not a convincing argument. But when it comes to Shabbos, people are like, oh yeah, we don't, let's not mess with Shabbos because it's working for us. But in 1976, maybe it wasn't so obvious. So I think in our circles broadly, people are more likely to use timers for more things, not just for lights. I think also, again, we use, my coffee maker has a timer. I use it on Shabbos morning. I use it on Friday to have a fresh cup of coffee Shabbos morning. I think there are other similar applications. I think the New York Times had an article a couple of years ago about somebody who they have like smart homes that they like make Shabbos compliant and like used for Shabbos purposes, and so they have every room has lights that go on a whole schedule and thermostat and every it's all done by a schedule, and that I think that's basically fine, but I think we just have a strong understanding that the like the computer, the email, whatever, that would be sort of bridge for. Yeah, Joel, want to say something?
Yeah, I'm wondering though, because like one difference is also that a lot of Shabbat happens in a person's own home. So you can have a multitude of practices. Maybe you don't really know what someone else is doing, right? I mean, I've seen in terms of Shabbos, I've seen all kinds of stuff. I'm like, well, that person does that. So right. Whereas with like feminism, for example, that's like, okay, what does the service look like? Or
that's interesting. So some of these like women in Orthodoxy and modern times issues are like about public roles. That's a good point. So like you can't just let everyone do their own thing because it impact, everyone sees it and it's like the nature of the shul. Whereas Shabbos observance is kind of, I don't know, if like you could be right. You could be right. There's some of that. There is also a communal aspect. It's hard to like kind of be. It's true. People definitely heat food in certain ways, and they make their, they make their tuna salad different ways, and they do or they don't open cans or open, but and that doesn't necessarily impact other people. If I have a more strict or less strict opinion on this, that's true. I think generally though, there's a sense of this, like that in this age of electronic communications, and like that's what is so there's one more source I want to say. Do you want to say something before we go on, or do you want to? No, okay. So let's look at the Rambam. This is where the Rambam describes muktzah, okay, basically, which is what we know as muktzah, which is a rabbinic prohibition. Okay, the sages forbade the carrying of certain objects on the Sabbath in the same manner as one carries during the week. Why was this prohibition instituted? Our sages said, if the prophets warned that the manner in which a person walks on the Sabbath should not resemble the manner in which he walks during the week, and similarly, one's conversation on the Sabbath should not resemble one's conversation during the week, as it's written, refraining from speaking about mundane matters, surely the manner in which one carries on the Sabbath should not resemble the manner in which one carries during the week. So the whole categories of muktzah were created. You can't, certain items that have no Shabbos purpose, etc. You can't. In this manner, no one will regard the Sabbath as an ordinary weekday and lift up and repair articles, carry them from room to room or from house to house, or set aside stones and the like. These restrictions are necessary, for since the person is idle and sitting at home, it is likely that he will seek something with which to occupy himself. Thus, he will not have ceased activity and will have engaged the motivating principle of Torah's commandments. Thus, he shall rest. Right. So there's sort of the sages wanted the day to be more different. I think elsewhere the Rambam writes, he writes also that, once we moved from the farm to the city, at some point in Jewish history, right, we went from mostly being farmers to mostly living in cities. That's sometime in like ancient times, a very long time ago. We moved to the city and we never looked back. Okay. But once we left the farm, most of the malachot of Shabbat are things we never do any day of the week. Okay. I have not threshed in many a year. Okay. I have not plowed. I have not winnowed. I have not skinned an animal hide or made grooves in it to, right? Okay. So, and so these restrictions of muktzah end up being, the rabbinic restrictions of Shabbat end up being the things that are actually what make the day different. And we have this mandate that the day should be different. So these rabbinic restrictions were added to make the day more different, certainly necessary once we left the farms and moved to the cities. I would say now that we have, right, there's no clear malacha, and that, when electricity was developed, everyone agreed you can't use electricity on Shabbat. There were several different rationales offered. One, Chazon Ish says that closing electric circuit is building. It's like mitaken clear. That I might turn on my radio. It's like I close the circuit. Before it wasn't a radio, now it's a radio because I closed that circuit. So he would say every time an electric circuit is closed, that's building a tool. It's building something. Every time I guess, open a circuit, I'm destroying something. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, another great 20th century, he died in 1995, spring of 1995. He says, no, like when I close a door, I'm not building a wall, right? When you close a circuit, you're not creating a radio. The radio existed before, I'm just operating a radio. It opens and closes. That's just how a radio operates. It was a radio before you turn it on. Just as I close a door, I'm not building a wall. And Shlomo Zalman ends up saying, which is how I was taught, and makes a lot of sense to me, it's not obvious that there's any malacha, any of the 39 categories of labor that are necessarily implicated in electricity, unless the device, like an electronic lawnmower, that's like kotzer. That's malacha, right? An electronic oven is cooking, but just electricity per se is not malacha. The use of our phones and computers, it's not obvious that there's any malacha entailed in using them, but it defines our Shabbos much more than threshing and winnowing and things, which we don't do anyway, even during the week.
So I
Yeah.
think along those lines, that's what we know when we see it, is that there is actually an internal logic there,
Okay.
which is that to the extent we are comfortable with timers, it's because the end product, the work is invisible, right? Like if your lights go off while you're sleeping and back on in the morning, right, or whatever it is, like you're just restoring it to an end state in which you could enjoy something that you're allowed to enjoy, lights being on, right? If your dishwasher goes on while you sleep and you have clean dishes in the morning, you're just using clean dishes, which is what you're allowed to do anyway on Shabbos. Your electric lawnmower is mowing a lawn, which you can't do on Shabbos. So I think there is like a sense, I think the sense of our internal sense has logic to it.
Yeah, so what about a timer? What if my daughter has she has one of these little star projectors, it makes a little light show on her ceiling at that time. So that's sort of, it's just a timer, it's just a light and a timer, but you're sort of enjoying it and watching a show. So that would be I think maybe problematic. Also, there's stories of people who the lights go off at the end of the meal so that the guests leave and then it goes back on 10 minutes later once they're, that's like another famous you never heard that? Okay, okay. Now you'd be very suspicious, okay?
They would use their computer on Shabbos, except they wouldn't type. That was crossing the line.
Interesting.
Voice commands only?
Yeah, it was only voice.
Yeah, it's 60s.
Yeah, so I don't think that's so tenable, but I appreciate the attempt. I also knew somebody in college who he was a very idiosyncratic Reform Jew. So he took Torah and mitzvot still does very, very seriously, but as an informed Reform Jew, so he didn't feel bound by it. He made informed choices and whatever. So he was the only authentic Reform Jew making educated, autonomous decisions. And so he drove on Shabbat, but he wouldn't pay tolls. So he used to, this is before Google Maps, so he would no, he would get tickets. He would it's the South. I can't, no, he would devise routes that didn't involve paying tolls. Because he didn't, no. He didn't break the law. He felt like he didn't feel that driving was inconsistent. So I don't know. I think there's a need for some objective standards, but I think there also is room for some subjective standards. The final source, which I think you'll have to read, and this is a letter, the Adah Journal, a long time ago, published an article by Rabbi Saul Berman about playing sports on Shabbat, and he generally takes a lenient position playing sports on Shabbat. And Terry Novetzky wrote a letter saying we have to also care about the spirit of Shabbat, and Ramban writes very powerfully that we have a positive command that Shabbat should be a restful day, which is separate from all the malachot. The day should be tranquil and restful. Like you could carry things inside your house. That's not carry, right? As long as you're right. Like schlepping things from the attic to your basement is not a malacha, but that's not a restful day. That's the example the Ramban gives. And so Terry Nevetsky in this letter says we have to, like, that's also, again, you can't just be technical when it comes to Shabbos. You also have to think about the spirit, and that's a halachic obligation to care about the spirit of Shabbat in a holistic way that transcends the like very, very concrete objective halachic standards. There's going to be some subjectivity. I mean, I think in terms of the dignity of Shabbat, like I think lots of arguments in my household over the decades about what clothing is Shabbostic and for which types of activities. That's like a perennial, issue. I think there was a rabbi I know who once gave a very, very angry speech to his congregation because he felt that because the men were coming back from Mincha without neckties. And that was on Shabbos afternoon. And he thought that was like, I think it was a Yom Kippur like topic. That was like so there's a certain amount, obviously there's different communities are going to express this differently. And, but I do think that the attempt is valid. Okay. Ari, and then, yeah.
The traffic lights there on Shabbat.
Yeah.
What's the rationale behind that?
I think the rationale that's like grubber. That's the traffic lights. It's indirect. You're not. You're sort of standing there, and it's not perfectly
Random.
It's a little bit random, and it's also not like you're not pushing a button. You're just standing there, and it's bouncing off of you and signaling something which starts the thing, and so it's an indirect cause. Eventually, doesn't work that well. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Ari, you want to say one more comment, and then you got to get to Marv.
Yes, just on the concept of doing things that enhances Shabbat or makes like turning on the light or off, automatically, which is, I think, connected with it's something that it's helping us to enhance the day. That could be stretched and applied for many things.
It has to be. I think there are objective standards. We have to follow the objective rules. We have 39 malachot. We have rabbinic prohibitions as well, but there also is a need for some judgment calls, and I think we see that here because I think Rav Moshe realized that with modern technology, you could stay within the confines of all the objective rules, and you could end up with no Shabbos because all the factories are running. And your household looks the same, and you're not right. And just like the rabbis realized that once we left the farm, we could abide by all of the objective standards and have no shot. And Shabbos be no different, right? The shops are open. Right? I'm doing business. I'm buying and selling. I'm doing everything right as normal. I'm just not doing malacha. And so so they made the muktzah restrictions so that the day would be different. And so for us too. So technology gives us new challenges or new opportunities, I guess, to kind of exercise that judgment of abiding by the objective restrictions while also, preserving Shabbat beyond that as well.
I'm just in the end, is this idea of not being able to forbid it, but not being able to permit it. So what's the, let's say somebody wants to, there's a big playoff game and they want to, so is it forbidden, or is it just Zilzal Shabbos, but
leave the TV on. Well, that's right. This doesn't even get to that point. If you just leave it on,
I would say that seems to me a violate. The Ramban that Terry Nevetsky quotes that there's a mitzvah. I say a positive mitzvah that Shabbos should be a tranquil, restful, different day. Would argue it would be a negation of the positive Torah obligation that Shabbat is a holy, restful, tranquil day. If you're watching the playoff game, But again, but to say that it's forbidden to set a timer because of that I think is sort of, you run into some of the problems that he struggles with here. All right, it's time for Marav, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you for joining the series. All right.
On the threshing point,
yeah,
is that the first thing you're allowed to do?
I think the Yantif, the only thing you're allowed to do is from